Welcome to Urban Horror, where we uncover the twisted truths behind the legends you thought you knew. Tonight, we take you back to Christmas Eve, 1887, a night of snow, silence, and terror. This is the chilling story of Elias Porter, a young boy who learned the hard way that Santa Claus isn't always a jolly gift giver. Some say he never brought toys at all. They say he came to take something far more precious. Brace yourself, because this is not the Santa you grew up with. This is the Soul Snatcher. In 1887, in the snowy village of Windhelm, there lived a boy named Elias Porter. He was 8 years old, full of curiosity and wonder, and like most children, he eagerly awaited the arrival of Santa Claus on Christmas Eve. But that year, Christmas would be different. That year, Christmas would bring something far darker than gifts. It began with a warning. Elias's grandmother, a frail woman with trembling hands, sat by the fire on Christmas Eve, her voice barely above a whisper. She spoke of a Santa Claus that no one dared to believe in anymore. Not the jolly, gift-bearing figure of modern tales, but an older, more sinister version. One who came not to reward children, but to punish them. One who didn't leave presents, but took something far more precious.
Stay asleep, Elias. If you wake, don't look for him, and whatever you do, don't let him see you watching.
Her words sent a chill down Elias's spine, but curiosity burned brighter than fear. After all, wasn't Santa supposed to be kind? Generous? How could the man in red be anything else? That night, the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. Snow fell thickly outside, the windows frosting over with icy patterns. The fire crackled softly, casting fleeting shapes across the walls, but even its warmth felt fragile against the growing unease. Elias lay in his bed, clutching the edge of his quilt, staring at the ceiling. Every creak of the wooden beams above made his heart skip a beat. His parents' reassurances from earlier seemed distant now, like the echo of a dream. His grandmother's voice, however, was sharp and clear in his mind.
Whatever you do, don't let him see you watching.
As the clock struck midnight, the first sound came, faint and distant, a soft jingling, like tiny bells swaying in the wind. Elias's breath hitched. He sat up slowly, his heart racing. The sound grew louder, closer, and with it came the groaning of wood, as if something heavy had landed on the roof. He clutched the blanket tightly, debating whether to hide or investigate. A part of him hoped it was his imagination, but the other part, the part fueled by curiosity, urged him forward. Slipping out of bed, Elias crept toward the living room. The icy floor sent a shiver up his spine as he tiptoed past the doorway. The jingling stopped abruptly, and for a moment, the house was silent. Then, the fire roared to life, the flames surging higher than before. Ash began to fall from the chimney, drifting down like black snowflakes. Elias froze, pressing himself against the wall. His breath came in shallow gasps as he watched the hearth, his wide eyes fixed on the strange display. A low, rumbling noise echoed from the chimney, growing louder and deeper. And then, with a burst of soot and embers, a figure emerged. At first, Elias saw only the red cloak, thick and heavy, its hem streaked with ash. But as the figure stepped fully into the room, his heart sank. This wasn't the Santa Claus of storybooks. The man was tall and gaunt, his limbs unnaturally long. His pale face was hollow and sunken, his cheekbones sharp enough to cast shadows. His eyes glowed like smoldering coals, and his crooked grin stretched impossibly wide, revealing yellowed teeth. A long, scraggly beard hung from his chin, matted with grime. Over his shoulder hung a large sack, but it didn't bulge with toys. It writhed and trembled, as though something alive was trapped inside. A faint, muffled cry escaped from the sack, and Elias's stomach twisted with fear. He clamped a hand over his mouth, his body trembling. The man moved with an unnatural grace, stepping toward the Christmas tree. He set the sack down with a heavy thud, and it shuddered violently. Elias's breath caught as he stared at the sack. The fabric stretched and bulged as if something inside was pushing against it. Then, to his horror, a A small hand pressed against the material, pale and ghostly. The faint cries grew louder, sending a cold shiver down his spine. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a long, blackened list. The edges of the paper were singed, and the names written on it shimmered faintly in the firelight, as if they were alive. He ran a bony finger down the list, muttering under his breath. The whispers filled the room, growing louder and louder, though his lips barely moved. Then he stopped. His finger rested on a name, Elias Porter. The man's head snapped up, his fiery eyes locking onto the boy's hiding spot. A slow, wicked grin spread across his face.
A curious little soul.
Elias stumbled back, his foot catching on the rug. The floor creaked loudly, and the man began to move. He didn't walk. He glided, his boots never making a sound. Shadows stretched from the sack, long and inky, slithering across the floor like living things. They snaked toward Elias, their claw-like fingers reaching for him. Panicked, Elias turned and ran, his heart hammering in his chest. He fled to his room, slamming the door shut behind him. His back pressed against the wood as he gasped for breath, his mind racing. But the shadows were relentless. They seeped under the door, curling around his ankles. He kicked and thrashed, but the tendrils tightened their grip, dragging him closer to the doorway. Desperate, Elias grabbed the lantern from his bedside table and fumbled to light it. His hands trembled violently, but after several failed attempts, the flame burst to life. The shadows recoiled instantly, hissing like snakes as they retreated. Elias stared at the door, his chest heaving. The whispers outside grew louder, more insistent. The faint jingling of bells rang out, sending a chill down his spine. He couldn't stay. If he did, the man would take him, just like the others his grandmother had warned about. Clutching the lantern tightly, Elias crept back into the living room. The figure stood by the fireplace, his sack thrashing violently, as if the souls trapped inside were trying to escape. The man turned slowly, his burning eyes narrowing as they fell on the boy. The shadows surged forward, but Elias raised the lantern high, the flame keeping them at bay. For the first time, the man's grin faltered. There was something else in his expression now, something that almost looked like fear. Elias's mind raced. His grandmother had said fire was the only thing that could stop him. Summoning every ounce of courage, the boy grabbed a burning log from the fire and hurled it at the sack. The flames engulfed the sack instantly, and an ear-piercing scream echoed through the room, chilling Elias to the core. Faces began to appear in the fire, pale, ghostly faces of children. Their hollow eyes stared at him, and their mouths moved soundlessly, as if trying to speak words of gratitude. One by one, the faces began to fade, dissolving into wisps of smoke that twisted and writhed before vanishing entirely. Elias stood frozen, his hands trembling as the air around him grew heavy with the scent of ash and burnt fabric. The man let out a deep, guttural snort, his form flickering like a shadow caught in the wind. His fiery eyes burned brighter as he hissed,
This isn't over, boy. You can't escape me forever.
With one final glare, his twisted form dissolved into the darkness, leaving behind a pile of blackened ash and a single charred bell that glinted faintly in the firelight. The next morning, Elias sat cross-legged by the fireplace, clutching the bell tightly in his hands. Its weight felt unnaturally heavy, as though it carried some lingering trace of the night's horrors. His parents found him there, pale and shaking, and brushed off his frantic story as nothing more than a vivid nightmare. But his grandmother's face told a different story. She stared at the bell, her expression grim and her hands trembling.
He's marked you. He will return, Elias.
Her words haunted Elias, but life carried on, until, 2 years later, on Christmas Eve, Elias Porter disappeared without a trace. The snow fell heavy that night, blanketing the village, but all that was found of the boy was the bell, lying in the snow outside his empty home. Its faint jingling carried on the wind, a sinister echo of a tale no one dared to believe. And so, the legend of the Soul Snatcher lives on, a dark reminder that not all holiday tales are filled with joy and cheer. Could Santa Claus really be more than just a story? Or is Elias Porter's chilling account the echo of a forgotten fear? Either way, if you hear the faint sound of bells this Christmas Eve, maybe it's best to stay asleep. Thank you for joining us on Urban Horror, where we reveal the dark twists behind the legends you thought you knew. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon, if you dare. Until next time, sleep tight and stay curious.